Okay, so April, there's so much to do, so much to talk about. For those of you that I haven't had the pleasure of meeting, my name's Blake Shook, and I'm one of the co-owners of Texas Bee Supply. And Texas Bee Supply, as you guys know, is something that my parents and I started about 4 years ago. And it was kind of on a whim. It was something that my parents were looking for something to do to support them when they wanted to retire someday. My mom was a new empty nester, and I own and operate another company called Desert Creek Honey, and that's a commercial beekeeping operation and a honey packing company. And so I've been doing that since I was about 12. And my mom was looking for something to do after the kids all left home. And I said, let's try to start a beekeeping supply company and sell supplies and sell bees. And she said, great, you know what, let's do it. I can sit up there and watch the grandkids play, most days of the week. And my dad said, yeah, that's great. I can work in the afternoons on my other job and sit up there and work. I'm sure not many people will come into the store. And so we launched Texas Bee Supply like I said, about 4 years ago. And immediately, we had to go out and start hiring. I think we hired 3 people within the first couple of weeks because there was just a ton of people coming into the store all of a sudden, and it was just kind of an overnight success. And so it's been growing ever since, and a lot of that's due to my parents' hard work, and it's great to support them in that. And one of the big things I've always been so thrilled to be able to do with Texas Bee Supply is provide a lot of the educational side of what we do, and that's always been incredibly important to us as a company. Is hey, we don't just want to sell stuff. We really want to educate folks as well. So that's a part of what these are is finding ways to educate and to help, and not just to sell stuff, but we really want you to be successful in beekeeping because we all depend on bees and their success. So with that, before we jump into some really exciting material we've got for you guys today, just a quick reminder, you saw it on the slides before we got started, but we do still have Nucs complete hives, and I think a few packages still left. So our first bee pickups are coming up here in about 2 weeks. So we're super excited. Our first round of packages have already been shipped. Our second round is shipping soon, but you still have time to get some orders in if you need to. We have an awesome magazine this month, and there's a lot of really fun stuff. There's so much in the April edition because there's so much to do and talk about in April. This came out a couple of days ago, so if you haven't caught it on the website yet, then you can go to our website. One of the main big tabs says free magazine, and you can view that magazine right there on the website. So Sherry, did you have anything you wanted to quickly comment on this month's edition?
Well, always, I love it. I love this magazine. Look at that cover. Is that the prettiest cover ever? Cover of that magazine this month is awesome. Y'all really send some really good pictures, because I think if you peruse through the magazine, you'll see that when folks send over pictures, we put them in there. So we'd love to see your pictures and funny articles, anything. This one's packed full, just like you said, Blake. I won't take up time, but anybody not getting this, you're missing out. We really want to see you pick it up and see it every month.
Yeah, and thank you to Sherry, because she literally did 99% of it. I usually try to help put it together, and I was so busy in working bees that I was literally just emailing her articles through email, and she was formatting and putting pictures. And so thank you to Sherry for taking over this month. A few other resources. I mentioned these last month, so just don't forget them. If you're in one of our stores, you can pick these up. Our monthly tips booklet. This goes over kind of like these webinars every single month, what to do in the bee yard for your bees. And then the one on the left is our getting started booklet. So it kind of walks you through, if you're brand new to beekeeping, all the stuff you need to do to successfully get your bees home, take care of them in their first month, etc. And that's both those resources are free, like most of our educational resources. So okay, this is something I'm super excited about. So I'm going to take just a couple quick minutes and talk to you about this. This is something that I'm really excited about for my own commercial beekeeping operation. We've started using some of these frames, So there's a new frame company called Premier Bee Products, and they just started making a new frame. And we are Texas Bee Supply is the exclusive Texas distributor for these frames. In fact, it's really all we're selling now in our stores as of the last couple of weeks. So these frames, it's not very often in the beekeeping world that something brand new comes along by way of woodenware. I mean, we've been using the same basic woodenware since the 1800s as an industry. So these frames though, there's something really cool, a few really cool things about them. And I, like I said, I've been using these for a while in my own commercial operation. And so I've seen a lot of this happen that I'm going to talk to you about. But one of my most favorite things is they've got 30% more beeswax on that plastic foundation than all the major industry competitors. So there's 30%, just on a standard frame, there's 30% more wax sprayed onto that sheet, which means the bees draw it out a lot faster. And so I've taken, you know, half a box of these frames and then half a box of competitors' frames, put them in on top of a hive, and the bees will start drawing out all of these frames way faster. So a lot more beeswax per frame, which is so helpful. The other interesting thing is they've got 10% more cells per frame. So if you were to count the individual cells on these new TBS frames, there's 10% more cells than any other frame on the market. And you might say, okay, does that mean the cell is smaller? Actually, it's not smaller. The way it happens is if you look at this picture over here on the right, these are pictures of that I went out and took last week of all the other foundation. If you notice, when bees build honeycomb on top of the cells on most frames, see this lip right here? The foundation is actually thicker. The cell wall is thicker on the foundation than the bees foundation, than the beeswax. So most foundation actually has a cell wall that is thicker than necessary. The bees don't need it that thick, but it's just easier to manufacture. These frames actually have a thinner cell wall to match the cell wall thickness in nature. And so you actually get 10% more cells per frame by making that cell wall thinner and matching how the bees actually build comb in nature. So kind of cool. You're getting more brood, more honey per frame. And then the other cool thing is that the wax coating that we use on these frames is 100% beeswax, and it's beeswax from cappings, and there's no paraffin fillers. Most companies mix paraffin with the beeswax that they use to spray foundation. And you know, the bees don't really like paraffin much. So this is completely beeswax, and it's, you know, from the cappings wax. A lot of times when companies are spraying frames or foundation with wax, they're using pretty low grade wax. Using capping wax means the bees draw it out a lot faster. The other couple real quick things I'll mention, the wood itself is a really high quality wood. The joints are all glued with Titebond 3 wood glue, where it's the only frame on the market that I'm aware of that actually uses wood glue. Most companies use kind of like a hot glue and doesn't secure very well. And then it's all made in the US. So all this is manufactured, produced, et cetera, in the US. And then we also, if you want double coated frames, double coated wax, we've got that too. So anyway, enough on that. I'm pretty excited about it. I've used the first several pallet loads in our commercial operation this spring, and I'm kind of blown away at the difference and how the bees react with it. So pretty excited about that. Okay, so let's get started. So if you were here last month, you noticed that I mentioned that we were going to do something a little bit differently this April webinar. We were going to go live into the bee yard for the first 15 minutes or so of this class. And we're sort of going to do that. So we spent a lot of time over the last month trying to make Zoom work in remote bee yards, or even bee yards right up against some of our buildings where we could access Wi-Fi. And the Zoom connection was always pretty choppy, enough that it was kind of annoying to watch. So we did the next best thing. I was out in the bee yard literally a few minutes before I ran in and jumped on this call. And I filmed a couple of videos doing exactly what I wanted to show you live, but it was about 2 hours ago. So we're going to jump to those, and we're going to kind of just take a walk through the bee yard, and I'm going to show you guys um, how to split a hive really quickly. I'm going to show you a hive that's about ready to swarm. I'm going to show you a hive that needs to be supered, etc. So we're going to kind of jump to the bee yard and discuss what we see there. And while I'm getting there, one quick thing that I want to share is the bees were not happy today, and so you'll actually hear them kind of pounding on the microphone. And part of the reason is we've bought this big wind muffler to muffle the wind, so it won't be so windy on the microphone. Well, this wind muffler is actually black and very fuzzy, and the bees thought that it was it must be a bear, because the bees just dive bombed that microphone through the entire thing. Fortunately, it's not too bad. The muffler actually worked pretty well. But if you hear kind of that persistent dive bombing noise on top of the bees being mad, that's kind of what's going on there. Normally the bees are pretty gentle. So, okay, so let me share this with you guys, and we will get started. Sorry about that, guys. It wasn't sharing quite properly. I'm going to try one more time here. Okay. Here we go. Now it's working. I lied. There we go. April Fools, right? So there's your April Fools. Okay, perfect. Here
Hey everybody, welcome to the bee yard. I'm so glad you're here. And just so you know ahead of time, I always get questions on, hey, why don't you ever wash your bee suit? I actually did wash my bee suit. So this is my 3-year-old Texas Bee Supply super suit, and so it's showing a little bit of wear. But you guys are getting to see the behind the scenes bee yard work here today. So a couple quick notes. The bees are, as you can see, they're not terribly happy today. And that's a bit unusual. It's because earlier today, so I'm filming this a few hours before our webinar, and so earlier today, really just a couple hours ago, we made a bunch of splits in this bee yard, and we moved all those splits to a new location. In fact, I can turn this around here and you can see across the field there, those are a whole bunch of hives that we just split earlier this morning. And of course, when we split a couple hundred hives in a bee yard, they're not real happy afterwards. So that's why I've got a lot of bees buzzing around me. The other thing is that this is one of our commercial bee yards. And so we've got hundreds of hives here, and they're on pallets, as you can see, instead of individual bottom boards. And just so you know, that's okay. There's really no major difference. All the things we're going to talk about apply with just 1 or 2 beehives. So we're not going to be talking commercial beekeeping. But I've got a lot of hives here, so I can show you a lot of different conditions in one location. So, so hopefully that assures you that, hey, this is all still going to apply in your backyard. So let's take a look at some hives. Let's take a look at some hives that are ready for honey supers. I mean, this time of year, hives are growing quickly, and so let's take a look at a few hives and see, are they ready for a honey super or not? The most important thing I look at is when I first open the lid to a hive. That's when I'm really getting that first glimpse of just how full they are or are not. So when I open up the lid to this hive, I can see right away, you know, frame to frame, it's totally full of bees side to side. And so you can see, you know, I mean, it is completely full of bees. And so when a hive is this full of bees, it's time to do something. It's time to add a honey super, or it's time to make a split. In this case, I'm going to make a split. But another thing to take a look at is, okay, the top is full. So what does the rest of the hive look like? So you can give them a little bit of smoke, and you can crack the boxes apart and see, okay, what do they look like in between the 2 boxes? Are they also that full, or are all your bees just up in your top box? And so if we remove the top box, we can see, I'll show you, the bottom box is just as full, or more full than the top box. So when a hive is this full, it's time to do something about it. And so, like I said, you can either make a split or super, but I just quickly look between the two boxes, look at the bee population in the top box, and then decide, okay, they do need something, and so I'm going to either make a split or I'm going to go ahead and add a honey super. So this hive is already two deep boxes, and so at this point you could just go ahead and add a honey super up on top. And if your honey super is new foundation, then you'll want to make sure you wait to add that queen excluder after the bees start drawing out that foundation. If it's new honeycomb, you can put the queen excluder on, you know, right away and go ahead and get started.
Okay, so I'm going to share one more quick thing with you guys here. One more quick video. And this was part 2 out in the bee yard. This one's a little bit longer. This is where we show you guys how to make a split, and also when we get into swarming just a bit. So I'm going to share that with you guys. Here we go.
Hey guys, so I'm back at this hive that I mentioned a few minutes ago needs a super or needs to be split or something, and we don't really have time to get into a whole conversation about splits. We do have some splits classes coming up, but I thought, you know what, why not? We're out here. Let me just show you really quickly how to make a split. I'm going to see if we can make a split in, let's say, under 3 minutes. Let me set this up for you though before I run through and show you how to make a split. So I've got 2 deep boxes here, both full of bees and brood. You just saw that. I've got an empty box here. I've pulled the center 5 frames out of it. So I've got a feeder. It had 8 frames and a feeder. I pulled the empty 5 frames out because I'm anticipating that I'm going to end up with three hives out of this one. So I'm going to leave 3 frames of brood on the bottom box. I'm going to have 3 frames of brood in the second box, and I'm going to have 3 frames of brood in the top box, assuming I find, you know, 9 frames of brood. And so I'm going to set this up with 3 frames of brood in the middle of each one of those boxes, a frame of honey on both sides of those 3 frames of brood, and then empty frames on the outside of that. Because we're going to do this one fast, I'm not going to bother looking for the queen, but I am going to shake all the bees down into the bottom box so that I know the queen is in there, and I'm going to put a queen excluder underneath the bottom box, as you're going to see. And that's going to assure me that, hey, I know where the queen is. She's got to be in that bottom box. So, and then after we're done, we're going to let this hive sit stacked up until tonight. And then after all the bees move back up through that queen excluder and cover all the brood and equalize bee populations, then I'll take the top 2 boxes away and leave them in the same bee yard or move them to a different bee yard, and those will be my 2 new splits. And then what's left will be my very bottom box with the queen excluder on top, and I know my queen is down below. So I know my 2 top boxes, those are the ones that I need to move and add queens to my bottom box, because I shook all the bees down during the process like you're about to see, and put a queen excluder on top of that bottom box. I know that she's down below. So let's see if we can do this. Somebody can start the timer and see if we can do this in under 3 minutes. So the first thing I do is I give them some smoke. I usually start at the second frame because usually the outside frame is just honey. And I pull out the second frame. I see that it's just honey. Yep, see, we just have a frame of honey. I shake the bees off of it. I'm going to put it in my empty box over here to the outside. So that's one of the 2 frames of honey I need. I'm going to go to the next frame, shake the bees off. It's mostly a frame of honey. I've got a little bit of brood inside of it, but it's pretty much a frame of honey. I'm going to put it on the outside of, again, this empty box over here. So now I've got my 2 frames of honey. There's a frame of brood. So it's got a lot of eggs and larvae. You may not be able to see it, but it's a frame of brood. So that's one frame of brood over here in my box. There's a beautiful frame of eggs and larvae. You may not be able to see it, but that's a frame of eggs and larvae. That's my second frame of brood. Another frame of eggs and larvae. That's my third frame of brood. So now this box is good to go. It's got 3 frames of brood in the middle, frame of honey on each outside. Now we're gonna replicate that process with what's left. So now in this next box, the next frame, again, beautiful frame of brood, eggs, larvae, and cat brood. I'm gonna set this aside. And then the last frame on this side, just honey. So I've got another frame of honey. Again, I'm gonna set it aside. Now the last frame still down in this box, that outside frame, just a frame of honey. Shake the bees off, just a frame of honey. So I'm gonna set it aside. Now, I've got an empty box. So my second box is now empty. I've shaken the bees out of it. I'm gonna set it aside. So, I've got my bottom box, it's still full of brood. I've got this frame of honey that I set aside. It goes up here into my second box. Another frame of honey that I set aside goes into my second box. I had one leftover frame of brood. It's going in the middle. And then I'm putting some empty frames that don't have anything on them on the outsides. So in my second box here, I've got 2 frames of honey, 1 frame of brood. So I need 2 more frames of brood in this second box. So down below here, I'm looking for at least 2 frames of brood, and I need to leave them 3 frames of brood. So I'm hoping there's at least 5 frames of brood in the bottom box. So here's 1 frame of brood of eggs and larvae. So now I'm up to 2 in this box. And here's my third, another frame of brood. So now I've got 3 frames of brood. And I've still got 3 frames of brood down here in this bottom box. So I'm going to center, I'm centering those frames of brood in the bottom box. I'm making sure they've got honey on the outsides of those. And then I'm putting my empty frames that don't have anything on them outside those frames of honey. So all my bees are still in the bottom box. I've got my queen excluder, putting it on top of that bottom box. And now I'm adding these boxes that we set up on top of that queen excluder. 1, 2. Lid back on. Sits till tonight. All done. So let's take a look at another hive here. This one is quite full, as you can hopefully see from the angle. Right when I open the lid, I mean, it's 2 deep boxes already, and both deep boxes are full of bees. And so this hive is actually thinking about swarming. And so I wanted to show you what that looks like. So the first clue is when both of your boxes are near 100% full, those bees are going to be trying to look for somewhere else to swarm to. When your top box is 80% full, that's when it's time to take action. Both of these boxes are 100% full, and so that's my first clue that, they may be getting ready to swarm. Now the next clue that you start looking for is, do you see queen cells anywhere? And so right off the bat, when I take the lid off of this, when I pull a frame out of this hive, look what we find. So we've got queen cells here and down here. So you can see they've already got capped queen cells inside this hive. And so that's my first dead giveaway that, you know, there's something up. Now the other thing is they still have eggs. So I know they still have a queen, but they've got capped queen cells, which means they are on the verge of swarming. Let's look at another frame in here. And this one has queen cells that are just a little bit younger. Oftentimes you'll see swarm cells on the bottoms of frames. And so if you look here, you can see these swarm cells. They're not capped yet, but they've actually got larvae inside of them. And so what you can often do is you can kind of peel back that capping and you can see that larva directly inside. I hope you can see it. That larva inside these queen cells. And so that's the way, if there's nothing inside of them, then there's, you know, it's no worries. But if they have that white royal jelly and those larvae inside, it means they're preparing to swarm. You can see right here, here's another beautiful queen cell. See, full of royal jelly. It's got a larva inside of it. So when a hive gets to this point, your only option, in my opinion, once they already have queen cells, especially capped queen cells, in my opinion, the only way to actually stop them from swarming is to make a split. And so you split that hive 3 or 4 ways, you know, a couple frames of brood per split, and that usually shuts down that swarming instinct.
So there you go. So that is just a little bit out in the bee yard. And what we'll do next month is we will take a look at a hive that is bringing in honey. We'll look at a hive that where the honey flow has really started. And we'll take a look at, you know, what, you know, when it's time to add a super, maybe time to add a second super, when it's time to add a queen excluder, you know, so we'll look at a lot more of that out in the bee yard. So, and by the way, when we send a follow-up email out, we'll also include links to those videos, and you can watch them probably much clearer without the jerking that comes with Zoom. So, okay, so let's talk a bit about April and what we've got going on here. This is actually, I snapped this picture as well. This was that same bee yard you just saw right when we were wrapping up making splits. So that's why the bees were not happy, because we had just made a bazillion splits. I think we'd made 450 splits out of that yard. And yeah, the bees weren't happy, as you could tell. So kind of what we've been up to, you know, we've been working on splitting our bees. We've taken essentially really good, strong hives like you saw in the video, and that are 2 deep boxes full of bees, full of brood. And then we divide those up into smaller hives to make splits, or we make them into Nucs that we then sell. And these are some pictures of us making Nucs here on the left. We often do it at nighttime, and that way we keep all the bees inside of a Nuc box when we transfer those frames of brood into a Nuc box. And then you can see these Nuc boxes are all spread out here on the right, and they're spread out kind of in that somewhat erratic pattern, so that we put a queen cell inside those Nuc boxes, and that queen has to hatch, and then she'll go out and she'll mate with drones, and she's got to find her way back to her specific hive or Nuc. And so that's why we kind of put them in a sporadic pattern along a tree line. You can see we even paint different things on the lids so that each Nuc box is a little bit unique, and that allows the queen to come find her way a little more easily back to the hive. So this is a picture in the upper left here of us just putting a queen cell. That's a queen cell that's going to hatch within 24 hours. Some of them, like our golden Cordobans, will actually put a fully mated queen into the Nuc instead of a queen cell. And then this picture on the far right is just for fun. It was, that one got a little too full of bees. You might not be able to tell that's actually a Nuc. There's a Nuc under there, and it had so many bees in it that you couldn't see the Nuc box. So we're going to sell that one for an extra $10. But and then just a couple other really quick little videos here on the far left. This is the nooks that we actually, splits that we made out of that bee yard that you saw. We picked up those splits and moved them to this bee yard, and we were actually feeding those this afternoon and putting queen cells in those splits. And those were for TBS, and so we'll actually take those and transfer them into brand new equipment once they're fully grown and the queens have successfully started laying, and that's what we'll sell our complete hives. That's how we sell our complete hives. So, and then one final picture here. This is just too cool. There's really no applicable practical reason to show it, but this is a queen emerging from her queen cell. So we had some extra queen cells and we put them in one of our incubators, and you can see her just emerging out of that queen cell. And so that's what we're putting into these nooks or these hives. And then usually within about 24 hours, that queen will emerge and she'll hatch. She'll go on a mating flight about 5 or 6 days later, come back and start laying eggs. So that's what we've been doing. I'm sure you guys have been busy with your bees too. It's certainly the peak season. Spring blooms, everything's blooming. So I can't even begin to put all the pictures up here. I mean, the blue bonnets are blooming. The yellow mustard down in the lower left, you're starting to see fields turn yellow with this stuff. It's an awesome early nectar and pollen producer. The dewberries are blooming here in the middle. The red buds are in full bloom. Dogwoods are blooming in East Texas. Yaupon just started blooming in Southeast Texas. I mean, everything's blooming everywhere, which is why spring is just so good for bees, and they grow so quickly in the spring because there are just so many blooms. So kind of what I'm seeing right now as far as current conditions and kind of keeping that terrible freeze we had in the back of our minds, here's kind of what I'm seeing at this point. Brood rearing appears to be fully caught up. So back in our March call, we were kind of talking about, well, brood rearing is a bit behind because of that freeze. Now it's fully caught up. Hives are thriving. They're growing incredibly fast. Looking at hives, I have a hard time telling there ever was a freeze because they've just fully rebounded. There's a tremendous pollen flow. There's no shortage of pollen whatsoever. As you just saw in that previous slide, everything's blooming. So absolutely no need for pollen patties. The bees are bringing in tremendous amounts of pollen on their own. There's an early nectar flow in some regions. All regions have nectar coming in, but in most cases, it's only enough for the bees, not enough to make a surplus. And in many cases, and I would say in most regions, you might still have to feed your bees. They may not be bringing in enough nectar to sustain themselves without some additional food. That's kind of what I'm seeing in North Texas, parts of East Texas, and parts of Southeast Texas. They're bringing in enough nectar as well to not need food. But you got to watch your beehive. You know, are you seeing frames of shimmering uncapped nectar that they're, and you're not feeding, and yet they still have several frames of that uncapped nectar? Or do they really not have much uncapped nectar? And if that's the case, it's a good thing to start feeding. And we'll take a look at that out in the bee yard in our May call a little more closely. Swarming is also in full swing. We've caught several swarms lately. We tend to set up swarm traps in all of our bee yards. That's because when our hives swarm or swarms are attracted to our bee yards, we can catch them, but there's swarms everywhere right now, and that'll only increase. Natural swarms seem to be a bit delayed from feral hives because of the cold we had back in February. And so swarm season seems to be a tad bit late this year. So I really feel like through the month of April and through May, we're going to see a lot of swarms. But it's a little delayed right now. And in fact, it could be a bit less this year than we normally see, because that cold snap in February seemed to kill a lot of the feral hives. And so we may not see as many feral swarms as we usually do. Major nectar flows, I think, are still on schedule. I was really surprised. I felt like after that major freeze, we would kind of possibly see the nectar flow a week or two delayed, but I'm already seeing our major nectar flow flowers already up and on schedule and leafing out. And so, we might be a week late with our major nectar flow, but I would be surprised if it's more than a week. And for point of reference, in most of the South, that is the first week of May. You know, from the last week of April to the second week of May is kind of when that major nectar flow historically begins, and that's when we start making surplus honey for us to eat. Inside April hives, you know, you saw in the video, you saw some April hives and what's going on, but I'm seeing, you know, full frames of brood like you see over here on the left. In the middle here, I'm seeing a tremendous amount of larvae, and on the far right, just those beautiful frames of eggs. It's just awesome to see. And so this is, there's a lot of everything inside hives right now: brood, nectar, pollen, all stages of brood, etc. So you should be seeing all of this in abundant quantities throughout your hives. So I just noticed in the chat, Dodie mentioned that Indian blankets are close to blooming in the Austin area, that's amazing. I mean, that's kind of in North Texas. We're not really seeing the Indian blankets quite yet, but they're up, and I would say they're about 3 weeks away to 4 weeks away. Scabiosa, which is a major nectar producing plant in Northeast Texas as well, is only about 2 weeks away. In the Southeast Texas area, you know, the tallow trees are a major nectar producer. They're a little bit late. I mean, they're really just leafing out well now. So we may see tallow start more like mid-May in some regions, depending on how far north of Houston you actually are. But overall, I mean, in some regions like Austin, you know, you may only be a couple weeks away from major nectar flow. Northeast Texas, you're probably still 4 weeks away. Southeast Texas, you're 3 to 4 weeks away. So it's coming. It'll be here before you know it. Let's switch gears a bit and let's talk about caring for your hives right now. So before we get into caring for established hives, let's talk a little bit about caring for brand new hives. So whether it's a brand new hive you've just purchased, whether it's a Nuc or packages, let's talk about caring for those. Then we'll talk a bit about caring for splits. If you've made splits, we'll talk about how to take care of those through April. And then we'll kind of wrap that up with caring for complete overwintered hives and what that looks like for April. But if you've got a new hive that you purchase or going to purchase, Nucs or packages that you're purchasing in April, that's when most people buy bees, April and May. The first thing to do is, from within 24 hours of when you get those bees home, feed them. Nucs and packages need a tremendous amount of food to grow. Interestingly, you know, I for just the fun of it, installed a package in one of our Texas bee supply bee yards there at one of our stores. I installed a package 2 weeks ago today, and they're drinking, it was just a standard 3-pound package, and that, which is, you know, if you get a Nuc, it's got more bees and brood than a package, obviously. And just the package was drinking a gallon of syrup every week. So in 2 weeks, they drank 2 gallons of syrup, and Nucs are kind of doing the same thing. So they need a lot of food. They have a lot of comb to draw out and a lot of growing to do. So feed within 24 hours, wait 3 to 4 days, and then after you've installed the Nuc or package, and then you can go back and fully inspect the hive. You know, check for, if it's a Nuc, check for larvae to make sure that the queen, eggs or larvae, to make sure the queen survived the trip and she's there and she's laying. You don't have to find her, you just need to see proof that she was there recently. And then for a package, you know, you're not going to see larvae certainly, but after, you know, I'm going to say more like 4 to 5 days, you should start seeing eggs. And I'll show you a picture in a minute of eggs from a package. You know, the next step is, step 3 is to continue feeding. You know, they may drink anywhere from 1 cup to 1 gallon per day, depending on how strong the Nuc or package or hive is. But keep feeding them. You know, the goal down there, you see the note, the goal is to balance giving them plenty of food to allow them to draw out new comb without giving them so much food that they fill up the whole brood nest with syrup and the queen has nowhere to lay. And that's where you just want to do those weekly inspections. And, you know, is there plenty of room for the queen to lay? Does she continue to expand her laying area? Or is everywhere you look nothing but stored nectar? In most cases in April and May, I rarely see a hive just become honey bound where they have too much honey. usually about as fast as you feed it, they're going to drink it and use it to grow in most cases. Next step is when the bottom brood box is 80% drawn comb and full of bees, add your second brood box and continue feeding. Now, this may take 6 weeks before they're ready for their second brood box with a package. It might take 3 or 4 weeks with a Nook. For complete hives, they might need it as soon as you get them home, or it might take a few weeks. But once that bottom box is 80% drawn comb, so they're working on drawing out those 2 outside frames, add your second brood box and continue feeding. When your second brood box is 80% drawn comb, you're ready to add your first super and stop feeding, assuming it's mid-June or before. If they've just got their 2 brood boxes filled and it's already mid to late June, the major nectar flows over and there's really no need to add a honey super. But if it's before mid-June, you can go ahead and add a honey super, and hopefully they will store some honey in your very first year. We'll get into way more of that in May and June as we talk more about honey supering. Okay, so caring for splits. So let's say you made splits already, or you're making splits here in the next 2 or 3 weeks. How do you care for those through the month of April? The main thing to keep in mind with splits is within ideally 12 to 24 hours after you make splits, you want to feed them. You may notice a recurring theme here, but you want to feed them and install the new queen within 12 to 24 hours of making that split. You're going to check back on that hive to ensure the queen has been released and is laying within 7 to 10 days. So give them a good amount of time, let them release that queen, give her time to start laying, make sure that she's been accepted, she's laying well. If she isn't, then what I usually recommend is letting the bees finish raising their own queen, because as soon as you make that split and take it off the original hive, they're going to start raising their own queen. If that new queen in the cage that you installed, if the bees killed her when she was released, then the bees still have those queens that they're kind of raising in the background. And by the time you go in and look 10 days later, those new queens are only going to be a day or two from emerging. And you're gonna, by the time you were to buy a new queen and install it, those new queens the bees are raising have probably already hatched, and they'll just kill a new queen when you put her in. So typically with splits, I do try to give them a queen. If they don't accept her, which usually only happens about 10% of the time, then I let them finish raising their own. But in general, I do recommend installing a queen in a split, because it gives you a huge leap on letting that hive grow. Because, if the bees raise their own queen, it takes, they select a 24-hour-old larva to start raising a new queen from. And from the time they start that process, it takes 12 days for that new queen to hatch. About 7 days after she hatches, she goes on a mating flight. About 7 days after she goes on a mating flight, she actually begins laying. So you've got almost a month in there where there's no new population being raised in the hive. Now, versus a mated queen, you put her in there as soon as you finish making the split within 12 hours, and she's out and she's laying usually in under a week. And so the hive kind of never misses a beat. So anyway, back to the split. Feed continually until that bottom box is 80% full of drawn comb and bees, just like we did with the Nooker package. And then add your second brood box, feed till it's 80% full, and then add a honey super and stop feeding when you add a honey super. So if you've got established hives that you didn't split, we're not talking new hives, we're talking more established overwintered hives. The goal is to have the second brood box full of brood and stored honey or syrup by the time the major nectar flow begins. That's kind of your objective with an established hive. If your second brood box is pretty much full by early May, then when you add your honey super, then this is going to allow the bees to store all that new nectar they're bringing in when the honey flow starts in early May directly into their honey supers, rather than having to use all that nectar to fill up the brood nest and fill up that second box to the levels they want it. This is kind of a trick that commercial beekeepers typically use. when we want to make a maximum amount of honey per beehive is we make sure that right when the honey flow starts in early May, our 2 brood boxes have a ton of brood, are full of honey or stored syrup, and there's almost no room left for the bees to store any incoming nectar in those 2 boxes. So that when that honey flow starts and we put our super on, they immediately start storing all that nectar coming in right up into the honey supers instead of having to store 20 or 30 pounds in the brood nests because there's so much empty space in there. So kind of working on that timing, it should be your goal if you've got an established hive. For established hives, you can also equalize brood as needed, and you can do this with any of the other type of hives we've just discussed. If you've got one hive that's really strong, one hive that's really weak, you can pull out some frames of brood and transfer it to those weaker hives to give them a boost in strength. We do this incessantly through the month of April. We are constantly taking brood from stronger hives, transferring it to weaker hives. And go back and watch our February webinar, which you can see it on our website or on YouTube. We really went into depth, our February and March webinars, we went into depth on how to equalize brood, bees, honey, etc. Especially for those established hives, monitor for varroa, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. And then of course, super when that top box is 80+% full. So again, don't let them swarm. Once they're pretty full, then it's time to go ahead and get that second super on. So one huge common question that everyone asks is, 1-to-1 syrup versus 2-to-1 syrup. Which should I use and when? We just talked a lot about feeding. And so I'm going to show you guys a awesome quick video from a good friend of ours named Dodie, who is a fantastic beekeeper, and she discussed with us when to use 1-to-1 syrup versus when to use 2-to-1 syrup. So let's see what Dodie has to say about that.
So what to feed your bees? So the 2 things that you can feed your bees are sugar syrup and pollen patties, but we're going to talk about sugar syrup right now. They need the carbohydrates. You feed your sugar syrup either 1-to-1 or 2-to-1. You have 2 different options, and they're both for 2 different things, 2 different times of the years. In the spring, for building up your colonies, you're trying to emulate what the bees are finding out there in nature, which will be the nectar. So you want it to be very thin, so it's 1-to-1. So anytime you're in the summer months when stuff is blooming, you're trying to emulate them bringing in more nectar. So 1-to-1 all summer long. And then, after you pull your honey in July, you start thinking about building up your bees for the winter. Not necessarily changing to 2-to-1 in July, but you start thinking about it. Because there's probably going to be another nectar flow in the fall, when the fall flowers start to bloom. But when those fall flowers start to pass away, then it's time to start really feeding them the 2-to-1 to build them up for winter. And 2-to-1, you're actually emulating honey. So you want it to be thicker. So 2 parts sugar to 1 part water. And that's what you feed them until it's too cold to feed them anymore. Till it'll be too cold for them to break cluster and drink cold sugar syrup, right? So that's when you want them to have it already stored in their cells so that they can eat it as they work their way up the beehive.
So there you go. Thank you, Dodie. That was a much better description than I could have given. So that's a great overview on when to use the 2-to-1 versus the 1-to-1 syrup. Couple quick topics here that I want to just throw out at you that are so applicable for this time of year: spotting eggs and larvae. So this is a big challenge if you're brand new to beekeeping or if you're over 40 years old, perhaps, and it's tough to see those tiny little eggs and larvae. This was actually the package of bees I was telling you that I installed. And this, when you have brand new white comb and black foundation, it's pretty easy to see, and you're zoomed up on an image, it's pretty easy to see those eggs. But if you have darker comb, older comb, it's way, way harder. So I just wanted to show you guys really quickly the number one thing I recommend when you're trying to see eggs and larvae, if you're having a hard time, make sure the sunlight is shining directly down into cells, or hold that frame so the sun itself is shining. I'm sorry, so that you can shine a flashlight down into those cells to really illuminate the bottoms of those cells. And then take some pictures. I mean, these were just pictures I snapped with my smartphone. And then the picture on the far right here, you can just zoom up with your smartphone once you've taken the picture, and you can see crystal clear down at the bottom of those cells. So bring your smartphone out to the bee yard, adjust the frame so the sunlight or a flashlight is shining down into it, take a bunch of pictures, go back inside or in the shade, and then zoom up, and then you can see those eggs and larvae. One other topic I want to hit is Chalkbrood and European foulbrood. These are two things that are not incredibly common, but when they occur, it's almost always in the springtime, April and May. And now we're a little bit lucky because, or unlucky, but usually Chalkbrood and European foulbrood do best on cold, damp springs. This isn't shaping up to be a cold, damp spring in the South. It's shaping up to be a hot, dry spring. Chalkbrood and European foulbrood don't do very well in hot, dry conditions. But the pictures here that you see are Chalkbrood. You know, if you see these kind of mummy, chalky looking mummies on your the front of your hive, or the picture on the right here is if you lift up and look at your bottom board, if you're kind of seeing these mummies, that's most likely Chalkbrood. European foulbrood is more, it kills the larva, the developing larva inside the hive. So if you're looking at the larva inside your hive and they just look kind of twisted and yellow and kind of melted, that's usually European foulbrood. So, you know, we've got more pictures on our website and you can Google more pictures too, but these are kind of some images of what it looks like. And then I want to jump to Lauren Ward, and she's going to share with us, you know, what to do when you do have those, you know, European foulbrood spores or pop up, and then you have the Chalkbrood. So Lauren's going to share with us how to fix that if you do see that in your hives.
So the best way to control for Chalkbrood and European foulbrood, really different diseases. Chalkbrood is Ascosphaera apis. It is a fungal pathogen. And as a lot of fungal pathogens go, it is environment dependent a lot of the time. So you're going to see Chalkbrood for the most part when you have that kind of wet, cool spring. So the bees are starting to build up, they're raising some brood, but especially the overnight temperatures are a little low and it's pretty humid all the time. And in saying that, so one of the things you can do for Chalkbrood is introduce a little more ventilation to your hive. So if you have a screen bottom board, maybe open that up a little bit. If it's not open, you can put a top entrance in your hive and let them move a little more air that way. I'd say that's probably more preventative, and if you have a mild case. At the end of the day, if I have a lot of hives and only one has Chalkbrood, I am looking at that queen really hard and thinking about replacing her. So Chalkbrood is a really easy thing to prevent if the conditions are not just terrible, with just the right kind of queen that has a little bit of hygienic behavior in her bees. So they'll go ahead and kick that Chalkbrood, those mummies out, and they'll fix their own problem. Now, if everyone has it, like I said, it may be more of an environmental thing. So the other thing you can do is if you've got a hive that's sort of more severely impacted by Chalkbrood, you can't replace the queen right now because guess what? It's early spring, you don't have a queen on hand. So we have all these things we'd love to do. I'd love to replace the queen, but usually it happens in, you know, March. And how many of us have a queen in our pocket in March? Not as many. And so in that case, what I like to go in and do is if I have other strong hives, I may go pull some good sealed brood from another strong hive and put it in that hive with the Chalkbrood. Now, importantly, I definitely don't want to go into the hive with the Chalkbrood and switch that comb back into the healthy hive. right? Because that would be a really quick way to give that healthy hive a problem. And so you may just have to, replace with a foundation or whatnot. But that'd be my recommendation on Chalkbrood is kind of mitigate the factors that tend to correlate with it. Like I said, that lack of ventilation. You can help them out by giving them a little sealed brood that's healthy, especially like I said, if it's purple-eyed about to emerge, that'll help them a lot. And then replace that queen if that hive is specifically bad. So that would be my Chalkbrood. Isn't to me a huge deal. I mean, it can be, but it's not the thing I'm most worried about. I'll put it that way. And that kind of leads us to European foul brood. And I'm also not horribly concerned about European foul brood, but it's more of an issue, I think, in a lot of the bees in Texas. So European foul brood, this is a bacteria-based disease, but it also has these things that kind of correlate with it. It's also more likely to show up in early spring, but it's also correlated with kind of variable nutrition. So when you have these early spring flows, where pollen and or nectar is coming in, but it's kind of coming in sporadically like this. At the bottom of that curve, that's when European tends to show up. And by saying that, you might kind of guess what one of my treatment options is to go ahead and feed that hive. Make sure and feed for the bees that are there. So if it's already fairly well weakened by European foul brood, you don't want to feed a whole ton of syrup at once. You might want to go kind of like Blake says, trickle feed a little bit, maybe a little thinner syrup. You might put some pollen on them, but get that nutrition right. And much like I said with Chalkbrood, you could go in to a healthy colony and help that struggling colony out. Chalkbrood is a thing that the nurses are actually actively feeding the larvae. It's in the brood food. And so if I go to help a Chalkbrood colony out, I want to get sealed brood, but I kind of want to take the nurses too. So I want to give them healthy newbies and healthy nurses. And again, definitely don't take that old comb from the Chalkbrood or the European colony and move it back to a healthy one, because you're causing way more problems. You don't want it to spread. So, and lastly, on the European, so again, it can be a little correlated with queens. I'd say probably less so than Chalkbrood. So you might make a note that queen had European. If she's the only one in your, say, that yard that does, I'd keep an eye on her potentially. But you might want to look at the age of the brood comb. So this is a situation where if you have really old, really dark brood comb, that may be where that bacteria is most present. So it kind of does accumulate in that old comb. And so when you go to move that one in to help it, maybe take out your oldest comb and throw it away, burn it, whatever you want to do. And lastly, if you have terramycin in your truck, again, with hobbyist beekeepers, like do you have a prescription, because you now need a prescription to get antibiotics for your hive? Probably not. But that's the other good thing you can do, because European, unlike American foul brood, is treatable with antibiotics. So you can give them a little bit of dust, come back 5 to 7 days later, do it again, and one more time, and you've probably fixed your problem. So, but yeah, get your nutrition right. Make sure there aren't any of those old, nasty, thickened, dark combs, because sometimes it'll just be present in one of those and nothing else. And give them a little bit of help, and you'll probably get it fixed. So, and outweight the, wait until a honey flow. If you can get them strong enough to make it to a decent flow, they'll probably fix it themselves.
So there you go. And the one quick thing I would add to what Lauren said, is if you do have a hive that's struggling with Chalkbrood or European foul brood, probiotics tend to work as well. You can get the strong microbial probiotics that we have or others, and that tends to help as well with Chalkbrood or European foul brood. Okay, so let's touch on swarms just briefly. That tis the season. This video never gets old. This is a hive swarming, and it's actually not looped. Let's turn the bees down a little bit. I feel like I hear that all day this time of year, so let's just I can't do that in the bee yard, so I can just turn the bees down on the webinar though. So, you know, it's just the time of year when bees are swarming. And so this is a hive I caught it swarming. And, you know, the far right here, you know, this is a picture of swarm cells I found, or I took inside the hive that was prepping to swarm. So one really quick thing I wanted to note on this before we jump into swarm prevention, and we're not going to talk too much about it because we touched on it last month, but queen cells versus queen cups, you know, it's important to remember that queen cells are a cell where queen is being developed. A queen cup is just an emergency queen cup the bees have in the hive in case something happens and there's nothing in it. Queen cells, where there's actually developing larvae in it, means something's going on. Your hive is queenless, the hive is trying to replace the queen, or the hive's getting ready to swarm. Something's going on if you've got a queen cell. Now, if there's just a queen cup where nothing's in it, it's no big deal at all. So what you can always do, you can see I did it in these two pictures here. I just, kind of like I did in the video, I just lifted up the caps. I kind of opened up that queen cell, and sure enough, you can see the little oral jelly, the larva. So something's going on in this hive. If they were super strong, bursting at the seams, and I still saw eggs in the hive, I'm going to say they're getting ready to swarm. If I'm seeing these queen cells with developing larvae in them, and it's a really weak, kind of sickly hive, then I'm saying, well, the queen died or they're replacing the queen. So I want to jump to one last video when it comes to swarm prevention. We talked about it last month, but I want to let Dr. Ellis share a few minutes on preventing swarms and the best ways to do that, because he has some unique perspectives that I thought were really interesting. So let's let Dr. Ellis tell us briefly how to prevent swarms.
If you're a beekeeper, you spent some time watching your colonies and you've seen them, what I call issue swarms. Now, a swarm is a marvel of nature. It's a beauty to behold. This colony that's sitting there, it wants to take this one colony and split itself to make two. And it does that by swarming. The swarm is essentially a honeybee colony reproduction. When a colony is swarming, it is giving birth. So that's beautiful. It's poetic. It's amazing to watch, and the way that it works is even more miraculous. But despite how beautiful it is, despite how amazing a biological phenomenon it is, swarming can be a problem for beekeepers. So beekeepers ask me then, how can I control swarming in my colonies? Well, there's a couple of things that you need to know. Number one, swarming tends to happen most a few weeks before the primary nectar flow. I want you to think about this just from a practical biological perspective. This swarm that just left this colony has to go and move inside of something such as a tree cavity or a wall in a house or a chimney, and it's got to move into that cavity and store enough nectar from the surrounding environment to build a comb and to store that nectar for the coming winter. So as a result, bee colonies tend to swarm before the primary nectar flow because they have the most amount of nectar available for them in the coming weeks. Research has shown the further into the nectar flow that bees swarm, the less likely that swarm is to survive winter. So if you put all of this together, bees most want to swarm when you least need them to. Remember, you need your colonies as strong as possible during the honey production months, yet bees want to split that colony immediately leading up to and during the first part of that nectar flow. So how do we control it? Well, there's a handful of ways that people do it. Number one, commercial beekeepers spend a lot of time simply splitting colonies. They'll split colonies well in advance of the major nectar flow, hopefully to try to keep those colonies from wanting to split later. A split is basically a controlled swarm. Another thing that you can do is you've got to remember that certain stimuli lead to swarming. Some of those stimuli you can't control, lengthening daylight, warming temperatures, nectar availability, but some of those stimuli you can control. For example, colonies tend to swarm when queens are older. So making sure you have younger queens pushing your bee colonies into spring. colonies tend to swarm when they're very congested. So as a beekeeper, you can add space to those colonies, right? Colonies tend to swarm once they've made ample preparation and there's plenty of queen cells available. So when the old queen leaves, there's immediately a new one that can emerge and take her place. So a lot of beekeepers will go into their colonies every 7 to 10 days and remove those queen cells during swarm season. Even in the colonies that I manage or have at the University of Florida as well, I require our team to clip the queen's wing. If it's the old queen that swarms and they try to swarm with her, she's unable to swarm. Clipping a queen does not control swarming. It's simply swarm insurance. But if you clip a queen's wing, cut queen cells every 7 to 10 days, add space as needed, consider splitting before, in advance of the major nectar flow. All of these things collectively can go a long way to help with swarm control. Me personally, I just add supers as needed to my colonies. I cut queen cells every 7 to 10 days, and I clip my queen's wings, and I hardly ever lose swarms under those scenarios. Again, as beautiful as swarms are, as majestic as they are, and biologically fascinating, we as beekeepers really want to try to stop those if we want to maximize honey production. And I think, all of these tidbits and tips that I've given you hopefully will help you as you try to address swarming in your beekeeping operations.
So there you go. Two really quick things I want to note on that. And I fully agree with almost everything that Dr. Ellis shared. Is the two things, if you're brand new to beekeeping, I would make you aware of. The picture on the far left here, there are multiple swarm cells and queen cells in this image. And if you're brand new to beekeeping, it can be really, really hard to find every single swarm cell to wipe it out to prevent a hive from swarming. So I would say if you're brand new to beekeeping, don't trust yourself to wipe out every swarm cell to prevent a hive from swarming, because you'll probably miss one. And if you miss even one, then they'll swarm. So really rely on splitting and adding space. The picture on the far right, this was a hive that had the wing clipped on a queen, and they actually crawled right out the front door. Instead of flying away for a swarm, they just crawled away. So I don't know how common that is, but sometimes they can be really stubborn about wanting to swarm, and they didn't swarm away. They just walked away. So because the queen couldn't fly, so they just walked with her. Okay, a couple really quick, brief things before we jump over to the elums and talk about drone layers. Is April Varroa. Again, hopefully you've tested your hive for Varroa mites back in March. You did any treatments if they were necessary. Most hives shouldn't have high levels in March and April and May if they were properly cared for back in the fall. But again, if mites are over 2 per 100 bees, then early April is your final window to treat, to be able to get most treatments out before the honey flow begins. So if you haven't tested, do a final test on your hive to make sure the mite levels aren't out of control. Again, like I mentioned last month, I would refer you to the Honeybee Health Coalition. So Google Honeybee Health Coalition Varroa mites, and they have a fantastic tool to walk you through the current conditions in your hive and what to use to control Varroa mites naturally, chemically, etc. So that's a great resource for you. Okay, I'm going to skip over that since we really covered when to add your second box. I'm not going to go into detail on requeening because we talked about this in the March webinar. You can jump on that and watch the recording. But again, just if you are going to requeen your hive, April is a perfect time to do it. I recommend you requeen proactively every year. Ideal time is April and May. I'm going to push you to our YouTube channel or the Bee Help and Questions section of our website. And we have several videos and articles on showing you exactly when to requeen, how to find queens, what to do if you can't find the queen, etc. So there's more than enough information on at those outlets to teach you how to requeen. And then you can also go back and you can watch our March webinar. And then if you go look at I believe it is the July webinar from 2020, we had like a third of the whole program on requeening, and I'm pretty sure it was a July webinar. So, okay, we're about to jump over to the elums, and they're going to talk about drone layers, which is a really common thing that you'll probably run across at some point in your beekeeping career. And before we do that though, I'm going to launch a really quick poll so you can kind of stretch, do something else, wake up, because what the Elam's have is fantastic. And but I want to do a quick poll, and it's asking, why do you keep bees? And I'm just curious, we'll publish the findings in our next Texas Bee Supply Monthly magazine in our May edition. And I'm just curious, do you keep bees for the ag exemption, to make honey, to pollinate your garden, to make honey, or because bees are just freaking awesome? And it looks like most of you have voted, and because they're freaking awesome is by far the winner. So who would have thought, a bunch of beekeepers, that would have been the winner. So to make honey is a close second. So 66% of you said you keep bees because they're freaking awesome, and then 54% said to make honey. This was multiple choice. Only 12% of you said to make money. So we all know that there's money in beekeeping because we keep putting it there. So thanks for doing that poll. We will share those results with all of you guys in our next magazine if you need a refresher of it. So, okay, with that, Elams, if you guys are ready, then we will jump over to you and let you guys cover drone layers, and I will start answering any questions you guys have. So
great. What size bee suit do you wear?
What size bee suit?
Yeah.
I'm a large, so yeah, I wear a large. I have the unfortunate situation of all the bee suits are a little too big around for me, and none of them are long enough. And so I get like an extra 6 inches added to the legs on my bee suits.
It's because you're this big around. Blake.
Yeah, that's the result of lots of beekeeping all day, every day.
I don't have that problem anymore.
Well, I have 2 comments from tonight's programs.
Yeah.
One of those is, you have a beekeeping career. The rest of us are on beekeeping journeys. That's why only 12% are in it to make money.
Well, James says career too, and I go, really? Is there really that many of us that are going to make it? But you know, some of us do make careers out of it.
That's right. Well, you know, one thing we learn in this journey career is that things don't always go right in our colonies.
Yeah.
And some pictures that we're seeing there are really interesting.
Yeah.
Drone layers, and that's not layers of drones. That's drones that are laying unfertilized, or drones.
Queens.
Drones that are appearing in our colonies, and yet we don't know where they're coming from.
Yeah.
So let's discuss that.
That's right. And I think that I don't know if there's a time of year specific that this happens more often. I guess probably now. But what we want to do is identify the culprit, because you've actually got 2 that could be the culprit. You've got the queen and the worker. The queen could be the culprit because, well, she could have aged out, gotten a little elderly, got her little queen, what do you call that, a cane walking around, where she's run out of sperm. I make joke about it, but it's really the truth. You know, we talk about queens aging out. One of an indicator is that she could become a drone layer. And then you've got the worker on the other end.
Now, the worker can create a tremendous amount of drones in a scenario where the queen is missing. Mm-hmm. Their ovaries can develop when it's generally accepted that their laying ovaries are suppressed by the presence of brood mm-hmm. within the colony, specifically open brood. Mm-hmm. And when that disappears from a queen being gone, for whatever that reason may be, they go into a survival instinct.
That's right.
So you can really get a lot of drone eggs laid by that, or laid by those girls.
You can. And somebody said, one of our questions was, what about they had an overabundance of drone cells, and what could they do to stop that being why their queen was laying? Well, I wonder if maybe you've got a drone layer queen, and that's what was happening. And I told them to listen. Hopefully you're still on and you're hearing this part of the program. So we've got to identify the culprit and see who is the problem girl in this scenario. So
well, if it's a queen, it could be as simple as what you're saying. Yeah. She could have run out of sperm towards the end of her lifespan of laying, or she might have improperly mated. If you had a virgin queen that went out and stopped laying shortly thereafter, it the same result as if she were old.
That is true. And there are indicators, some of them to me, and I had discussion with Blake during the week over this, because we've seen drone laying colonies over the years, and sometimes it's hard to discern between whether it's the queen or a worker, but there's some key points that he and I and James and I, we both know, and we want to point those out to you. Usually the first bullet point.
One of those is usually something that you can spot right away, and that when a queen runs out of sperm, she still has it ingrained in her that her goal is to lay an egg and it hit every cell and try to develop a pattern. So if you see a consistent compaction of drone brood, compaction, so you're looking very similar to what your original brood nest looked like when it was workers. Odds are we're still talking about the queen that's run out, and she's just doing her best.
And that brood will still emit brood pheromone, so it is still stopping any workers from laying because the queen's still present and she's still laying brood, just happens to be only drones. But I want to back up and say it may not start off where it's all drone brood only. She may kind of start where she's some regular brood and more drone brood. It may take a little bit of time before she completely runs out of sperm. It just depends on the queen. So it may not be a definitive, just one day she stopped laying worker brood where she's laying sperm with an egg. It may not be just one day. It may take several.
Something that I think is interesting is if you can picture a drone egg being laid in a worker cell. We all know that drone cells are larger than worker cells. So when that bee is going through the various stages of life, the worker bees that are still present within the colony keep having to add to the height and the width of that cell for that drone to survive. And in reality, what tends to happen, even though they do their best, is that when that drone emerges, it's typically smaller in size than a normally bred drone.
Isn't that funny? And because that cell is so small, it's a regular worker size cell, it looks bumpy and lumpy, like you see there.
Bumpier than normal. We all know that drone cells are larger, more, we like to refer it as, they look like a 22 shell. But these are much more disoriented than that. Now, one thing I also think is interesting, we talk about the number of eggs laid per cell in this. The queen, even though she's laying drone eggs, she's still restricting it to 1 to 2. Nothing changes in her habits.
Not much. What's the remedy?
Pretty simple topic. If we have a drone laying queen, then she has to be replaced. Requeening procedures come into play, and they're very straightforward. So it's pretty easy to spot a drone laying queen.
I think it is too.
And if you add to that the overabundance of drones,
the overabundance, that's your
key, really helps zero in when you consider the other factors.
All right, let's talk about laying workers. And I don't know if this is more common. I'm going to say it's probably more common in hobby beekeepers because we tend to lose more queens. It just happens. We're not always requeening every year, and sometimes we can accidentally kill one when we go in and inspect. So a laying worker scenario can very much happen to a hobby beekeeper's colony.
When that queen disappears for whatever reason it may be, we've got a time frame we have to go through before we lose that worker brood. We know that worker brood emerges in 21 days, so we've got at least roughly that long before the colony senses that there's no one here that can keep us from laying eggs.
That's right.
So those worker girls, they start doing some development of their ovaries or in a way that they possibly can. They carry no sperms, so they can only lay drone. But they start kicking into gear. Sometimes it's easy to think that maybe there's 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 or 10, but it's probably more common that there's 100, 200, or 300 in there, and you can't just look at them and tell who they are.
No, you can't. They don't have a little special crown that they wear that says, I'm a fake queen. They don't. There's actually hundreds. He's right. I want to key in on that 3 weeks. It truly is 3 weeks. You be queenless, for 3 weeks. And that's exactly how long it takes for the brood pheromone to go away because of that brood cycle. It just goes hand in hand. Once that pheromone from brood disappears, one of those girls is going to take on the job. Look at the picture, multiple eggs per cell. And it's not just multiple eggs per cell. It's like, I can't figure out where I'm going to put it. And you know why that is? Her abdomen's much shorter than a queen. She can't actually get her abdomen down into the bottom of the cell to land an egg perfectly upright. So she's just throwing them in there left and right. And that is a very good sign that it's a laying worker and not a drone laying queen.
That is a very good association between the two. We talked about the overabundance of drone brood. Eggs can even be laid on the sides of frame on top of pollen. They're really random. And a unique feature of this is they have no practice in doing this. So one will lay an egg or 2 or 3 in a cell. And then here comes another one right behind her doing the same thing.
Right.
And they're all just staged to the left and to the right, and there's nothing perfectly vertical. This is obviously a laying worker when you see those eggs in that.
And the word
fashion.
spotty, I threw it in there up under overabundance of drone brood, because we talked about the queen kind of laying in her pattern somewhat as she runs out of sperm, but the workers, they're just all over the place. Like James says, they're not schooled in that, so they don't know where to go. They don't have a pattern. They didn't get mated and have that innate ability to do that. So it's going to be much spottier. That might be another indicator that you've got a laying worker. All right, to save it or not to save it?
Okay.
That is the question.
Here's the question. We all love our bees. And especially if you only have 1 or 2 or 3 colonies, you have
because
low
they're
numbers.
freaking awesome, remember?
That's right,
Most
but that's
everybody
what
keeps them
won.
because they're
They're
freaking
freaking
awesome.
So the last thing we want to do is give up on them.
Yeah.
So we have some methods
but-
that are commonly discussed to help you get that direction,
Yeah.
but we have to consider what the possibilities are.
Right. Sometimes if the colony's been queenless for a long time, and we started with this one before we kind of gave you some remedies, because there are times that we just have to bow our heads and go, doggone it, we're going to have to just let this one go. Because if it's been queenless for a long period of time, you basically don't have any bees left. You couldn't add enough from other colonies to make a difference, but all you'd be doing was be building another colony. It doesn't make any sense. That's called a split.
Sometimes it's best just to save the resources before wax moths get them.
Yeah,
Shake them out
Mhm.
and just move forward with other approaches if
That's
there's something else
That's
to do.
exactly right. And we hate to do that too, but sometimes. So the key is to overcome that laying worker's ovaries. You've got to suppress that. So how do we do that?
We do it just like a regular queen did, in that if we're going to take the first step to getting the open brood pheromone back in a colony, we need to add some open brood. So we take some, assuming that we have some other colonies to work with, which is another great reason to have multiple colonies in your bee yard.
Right.
We need to take a frame from worker brood, uncapped frame, and add it to that colony that's in need, and do so every 5 to 6 days.
5 to 6 days over a 3-week period of time. You've got to develop some history in there to overcome that laying worker's pheromone, because remember y'all, she's emitting a fake pheromone. So you can't just go in and pop a new queen in there and say, okay, we're done. No, you go on the side. You can't do that.
Yeah, well, it took 3 weeks for them to develop the ability to lay
Exactly.
an infertile egg. So it's going to take approximately the same length of time, 3 weeks for that to be shut down.
Because of that worker brood pheromone that you're introducing continually over that 5 or 6 day period. For
That gives you cause to really think, are you willing to do that to your colonies that you have addition to that one? Are you willing to take a frame of brood out once a week, every 5 to 6 days?
Yeah, because
to try to save that one. Obviously, if you had very few bees on it, you wouldn't, because all you'd be doing is just making a split in reality. You'd just be transferring brood frames over to it.
The second method that might work, combine with another queen right colony using a double screen for a separation.
Explain that.
A double screen is, if you've seen a screen inner cover, it's kind of like that, but it's 2 of them with a space in between, and it's bound by wood. It's something you can get at a bee supply store, Texas Bee Supply, and it allows the pheromone of the queen and the worker brood and the worker brood from down below to travel, but the laying worker and the queen not to be able to reach each other.
What we'll do is we'll place that double screen on, and then we'll place the queen right colony on top. So the various pheromones will kind of blend together.
Right.
It takes a little while for that to occur.
It does, but it's worth trying if you catch it early enough. And I think that's key. We've got to catch it early enough, according to that first slide there. If there's not any bees, it's not worth it.
How long are we going to do that?
We're going to do that for probably 3 weeks.
We've got to do that for roughly 3 weeks. And then we're going to pull out and see what's happening. We want to continue to do it until we see queen cells being developed in that bottom box.
Or we've suppressed that worker, and we can just combine those two colonies.
You can do that as well.
So number 3, switch hive locations with a strong queen right hive, keyword strong, and the returning forager. So you're switching locations, another reason to have more than one colony. With a queen right colony, those foragers coming back at the end of the day, they're going to go in there and they're going to say, wait a minute, something's not right here. They're going to right the wrong. And then you won't have that laying worker within a very short period of time. Once that's happened, then you can requeen.
It's really funny what all they do. Not only will they go in and eliminate most of the laying workers, it's kind of like the hired guns going in, they're taking them out. But the ones that accidentally make their way back in, we did a switch. So most of them are going to be turned away at the gate, at the entrance. The ones that make again will be eliminated by the bees, the foragers coming in. But even more importantly in that, any eggs that they might lay will be discarded by the bees that are currently moving into that colony, the worker bees, because they're not going to allow that. As far as they know, that is still their colony.
That's
and
right.
They will return it to a correct state roughly in 48 hours. So this is a very easy way to do it.
It is. And bees are OCD. They want things that they want them each day. And with their house, when they get there, it needs to be like what they had focused on the last time they left. So truly letting them correct the problem, it's to me, it's a viable solution.
What is?
Viable
Obviously, a new queen has to go in.
And then a new queen has to go in. The last of the, two last slides, second to the last slide, shaking the bees out. It is considered a method, and we have done this, but it was at an earlier stage. It was semi-successful, but it's kind of like a friend of ours said, we did this and 90 steps later it worked. So
well, that's right. So
I don't know if it really worked. Okay.
So we took the bees over 100 feet away,
yes,
and we decided which frames we thought had the laying workers, based upon the captive brood.
Right.
And we shook them off, hoping that we were going to discard the laying workers, and then ran back as fast as we could to get to the hive before they did.
Right.
That's not true. What we ended up having to do was add open larvae over the course of several weeks.
We did.
And then it resolved itself.
We truly did end up doing the step 1 of the 3 options. But just going to shake the affected frames doesn't in itself works, in our opinion. So might not be a good use of your.
It absolutely cannot work, because the only thing that suppresses
is
laying workers is worker brood,
which is fertilized.
So you have to add a frame or two as time passes to make it happen.
So the takeaway, and I think this is important, the takeaway from this is that, kind of like with swarms, we've got to keep a check on our hives. We're week, 10 day, 2 weeks, every 2 weeks at minimum, you need to be checking inside your hives, looking, seeing what's going on, verifying you've got a nice laying laying queen, and that 1 egg per cell, things look good. You're going to be able to keep up with that because you're in there looking. You're in there and frequently.
And we're hearing that last item, the requeen yearly or often, almost as much as we do the words feed and varroa and some of the other things. A young queen is not likely to run out of sperm anytime soon.
She's not.
And if she's got sperm and she's doing her job and she has genetics like we all want, then this does not become a problem that we have to deal with.
It doesn't. That's right. So requeen yearly. And if you're questioning how to do that, it's really on a video. There's really not a problem. Let's see. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and give it back to Blake. Blake, are you there?
I am here. I was answering some fantastic questions.
Aren't they good
So
questions?
they always make my evening. So they're awesome. So thank you guys. That was super helpful. Drone layers are always a lot of fun. Hopefully you never have the displeasure of meeting a drone layer, but in case you do, now you know how to handle it. So with that, I mean, we're a little past 8. I wanted to just remind you guys to respond to the help@texasbeesupply.com email address if you have any questions. We'll be sending a follow-up email that'll have the link to view this recording, a link to products and videos we talked about. One other quick thing is that when you X out of the Zoom call tonight, there'll be a survey. And it's going to ask you to tell us all the things you love and do not love about this call. And so we'd really appreciate it if you'd fill that out. But until then, we will see you in May. Happy beekeeping. And if you have any other questions, feel free to keep putting them in the Q&A box and we'll hang out and continue answering any of those that you have. So it was fun, guys. We'll see you all in May.